Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Matza, and I know it is a challenge to get you all here on the first day of classes, but it's a really special guest that we have with us. Benedetta Calandra is an associate professor at the University of Bergamo. She has written 4 books in the areas of U.S. and Latin American history, but she is particularly a pioneer in areas of cultural history, social history, and gender dynamics. And the book she's going to present today, The Caribbean Body, Reproductive Politics Between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, was actually a book she helped research when she was here as a resident fellow at SAIS. And it's a particularly fascinating subject. She has really found an area that has been very little researched, and she puts it in a context of both the Cold War and the dynamics of US policy. So for my students, I want you to listen to her because she's going to present some surprising cases in Latin America, counterintuitive, where you liberal regimes that seem to be more restrictive about birth control and sterilization. So I will leave this, and we're so happy to have you with us, Professor Calandra.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Can you hear me correctly? Okay. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I'm very happy to be there, even if in this virtual way. Next time for sure will be physically in Bologna, which is a town I just love. I would like to share with you this PowerPoint presentation. So what is this medical doctor Helen Rodriguez was explaining us in this very, very short video was basically the difference between population and birth control. Birth control is something that is related to an individual choice, and what she was explaining us, it should be a right for every woman to decide when and if and how many children should she have or her family should have. While population control, of course, is linked to a more, let's say, governmental state choice, and sometimes has been used in order to control social subjects, mainly undesirable subjects, has been used by mental illness, has been used with the African American people, with poor people, and Puerto Rico is a perfect example of population control meant in terms of state governmental policy. It's a peculiar state from a political point of view because ever since the 1898 war, it was no longer a colony of the Spanish Empire. The United States entered in war, the Spanish-American War, and became a sort of US protectorate until 1952. As historian Raymond Carr reminds us in his book, Puerto Rico, a Colonial Experiment, this island has been constantly living in ambiguity between the Latino, Catholic, Spanish cultural point of view identity and the very, very near embarrassing US powers that was just around the corner, has been until 1952 an unincorporated territory of the United States, where the Puerto Ricans were a sort of second-class citizens. For instance, they had no voting representation in the Congress. So there were also several referendums between, last one was in 2020, to be admitted as state of the union, actually. So it's really a current process. It's going to be part, probably 100% as a state of the union. So gender analysis like the one that Laura Briggs provides us with, reproducing empire, it's very, very interesting because it examines the whole history of Puerto Rican people through the lens of this colonial relationship. And what she has actually found is that the control that the United States exerted on reproductive bodies in Puerto Rican were part of a sort of experiment. In her conclusion, her provocative conclusion, she says that Puerto Rico potentially represents the most important place in the world because imperial dynamics were tested in Puerto Rico and then extended and experienced on a global scale. Puerto Rico is also a very peculiar and interesting case in terms of population control, because in this island, this is an island in which almost 35% of women in their reproductive age has been sterilized. By sterilization, in this case, I mean tubal ligation. So it's not a reversible operation. Women after this operation becomes permanently sterilized. And the periodization is also very interesting, because these sterilization processes were carried out in Puerto Rico in the early 1930s. That was exactly 30 years after the United States and 30 years before the rest of Latin America. In the whole territory of the United States, starting in 1907, sterilization were carried out under a huge eugenic plan. We normally tend to associate sterilizations, as Professor Mazza were telling us, with the totalitarian regime, with the Nazis, with the fascists, or the totalitarian regime of the USSR. But in the most interesting and symbolically meaningful liberal democracy, in 1907, sterilization were being carried out in the United States. So in the case of Puerto Rico, it was just after the United States and before the rest of Latin America, in which it was a much more widespread practice in the mid-60s. There were two exceptions as far as the Latin American territory is concerned. The first exception was in Veracruz in Mexico in 1932, under a socialist government of Tejada. There was a preventive eugenics. And the very interesting second case, which is again literally counterintuitive, is that it was carried out in Chile in 1940 from, by a draft law that was carried out by, at that time, the health ministry, Salvador Allende, exactly the same man who would be so important 30 years later as president of Chile. So apart from these two cases in which sterilization was practically more an idea, a law, but they were never ever being practiced so extensively as it happened actually in Puerto Rico, we had no any other antecedent in the rest of Latin America. Of course, how do we get to this figure? How can you explain that 1/3 of the women were sterilized? It's a very complex process, and the answer lies, of course, in a result of an interplay between coercion and willingness. Still, anthropologists like Iris Lopez wrote a wonderful book about this category of coercion or personal choice, because it's very, very complex to give a straightforward answer that why 35% of Puerto Rican women were sterilized between the 1930s and the 1980s. The second reason why I chose Puerto Rico, and I found it particularly interesting, is that in this little island, thanks to the proximity to the United States, they were carried out the first so-called pill trials. The FDI, the Food and Drug Administration, needed to test a very huge quantitative of hormones that has been estimated to be around 20 to 40 times higher than those currently on the market. So in the beginning of the 1950s in Puerto Rico, on Puerto Rican women were tested the first birth control pills, whose name at that time was Enovit. You see in this picture, that was the very first pill. So, of course, the pill and these experiments have been very, very controversial. And in the third chapter of my book, Il Corpo del Caribe, Caribbean Body, I've been highlighted this paradox that women's body liberation that started after, of course, the pill was put in commerce, was commercialized in 1960s. So this slowly started the process of women's body liberation. Then, of course, it became much faster and more visible at the end of the 60s. But this process went through experimentation on other women's bodies, the bodies of the Puerto Rican. And still very, very interested and controversial is that the main financial sponsor is this woman you see here, Catherine Dexter McCormick. She was a philanthropist, one of the first women to be graduated in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She was a millionaire, so she put a lot of money in these pill trials. And I would like to share you a very short quotation from a document in which a letter Catherine Dexter McCormick is writing to another very famous activist of birth control, Margaret Sanger. She's talking about the experiments that this Dr. Pincus were carrying out. And she wrote, upon my complaining to Dr. Pincus of our lack of clinical wherewithal, how can we get a cage of ovulating females to experiment with? Okay, so it's pretty impressive that a feminist was, of course, talking about the Puerto Rican women as if they were exactly the ovulating females to be experimented with. So it's very, very striking. Again, on the side effects of this huge quantity of hormones, we have another interesting document. Of course, McCormick tried to say that there were no side reactions. They are, and I quote, miraculous in their harmless effectiveness. So any of it couldn't actually cause no kind of danger for no women. And the reality is that many women withdrew from the project because they have headaches, nausea, blood clots. A couple of women died, so we will never know if they died exactly because of the trials or not. No investigations were carried out. So in the analysis of other gender historians like Elaine Tyler May, American Families in the Cold War Era, what Tyler May explains us is that at that time, the birth and the population control were so linked interchangeably. So women like Catherine Dexter McCormick was a feminist, very interested in birth control for women. But at the same time, she was working for, let's say, the more broader, greatest cause of population control. It's something that we cannot separate. The paradox that also another historian of the Cold War highlights, Michael Connelly, is that these sort of population controllers, as Catherine McCormick was actually, tended to act in the name of an abstract humanity. Population controllers found it easier to think that of the world as a laboratory. So even if, let's say, their intervention was well-intentioned and performed so as to be minimally invasive, is by its very nature antithetical to the liberty it seeks to promote and protect. It assumes that the expert in his role as planner knows better than the individual what is in his best interest. And it's exactly the case of Catherine Dexter McCormick. She was so worried for the humanity, the women of the Cold War. She didn't care at all about the specific Puerto Rican women who were going through the experiments, the real experiments. Again, the gender analysis from Laura Briggs explains us that, of course, the medical researchers were accustomed to cost-benefit thinking. No, it's a very, very up-to-date topic. So at that time, the overpopulation, and I quote, shifted this equation. The dangers of overpopulation were construed as life-threatening, hence worth a great deal of risks. The greater cause of the control of population, the danger of population that in Latin America actually meant the danger of potential revolutions. We are during the Cold War, was the most important thing. Of course, I'm not delving into this topic, just mentioning it. The Puerto Rican sources I've been reading, like some feminist groups in Puerto Rico, some nationalist groups in Puerto Rico, some Catholic Church groups, were furious about the experiments, and they tried to depict Puerto Rico as el país de los conejillos de Indias, like the country of the Guinea pigs. Puerto Rican women were depicted as they were Guinea pigs, and went so far, that they also used the term genocidal politics. What's happening and what happened in the rest of Latin America? Of course, there's no time to give you an overall picture of the rest of the continent, but I would like just to pick and choose one case, the case of Bolivia in the early 1960s. As I told you earlier, the birth control in Puerto Rico was very, very active since the 1930s, and also the sterilization, while the rest of Latin America, we have to wait until the early 1960s. Bolivia is especially interesting case because what happened is that in 1969, there was a radical third world Bolivian cinema director, Jorge Sanginés, that produced this movie, which is called The Blood of the Condor. I'm not sharing the trailer because we already had some problem. It's a very short trailer, but still. The movie is about the Peace Corps that in the movie were called Progress Corps, but it's actually talking about the Peace Corps that were in Bolivia in indigenous communities secretly sterilizing local women. So once the community, the indigenous community, discovered that these Progress Corps were sterilizing women, attacked the Cuerpos de Progreso, the Progress Corps, and it was bloodshed. A lot of people died. It was a big scandal. That was the movie. But the most interesting thing is that in reality, 2 years later, I mean in 1971, when the government at that time discovered that the Peace Corps, the real Peace Corps who were in Bolivia, were carrying out a IUD, family planning, they expelled the Peace Corps from Bolivia. So the influence of this movie, even if this movie was depicting sterilization and the reality was a birth control campaign with IUD, was so influential that the Peace Corps were actually expelled from Bolivia in a, let's say, a very, very powerful indictment of foreign and domestic modernizing forces. So basically, what prevailed in Bolivia was this radical anti-imperialist movement that blamed these US Progress Corps, Peace Corps, to be awfully arrogant, and this again colonial sentiments that wanted to impose the IUD to the local population, and it was enough in order to expel the Peace Corps from Bolivia. So again, a gender analysis like the one Molly Geidel provides us with suggests that let's say there was a sort of struggle between US modernizing forces and indigenous nationalism. And in this case, the indigenous nationalism prevailed, of course. The Peace Corps in Molly Geidel analysis embodied the sort of the more seductive side of anti-communist modernization doctrines in Bolivia to induce Bolivians to want to help themselves out of poverty. We know from other books, like the one from Elizabeth Cobbs Hoffman, All You Need Is Love, the Peace Corps and the Spirit of the 1960s, that the Peace Corps were perfect good guys. That was, of course, invented by the very beginning of Kennedy presidency to test the new frontier. The Peace Corps, as Elizabeth Cobbs-Hoffman writes, conceived in the can-do spirit of the 60s, embodied America's long pursuit of moral leadership on a global scale. And they were, let's say, there is still a dilemma if they actually helped the countries they went to, and if they actually respected or not the local needs of the people. There was in this institution a great duality between idealism and pragmatism, market forces and human compassion. But as in this book is well explained, the Peace Corps also went through different scandals, because sometimes there were rumors that there were connections with the CIA, to which extent they were part of the global Cold War on poverty. Purcell, this is the very last slide I would like to share with you, is a young Chilean historian who's actually still working on the Peace Corps, this time in the case of Chile and the whole South America. He finds that, of course, the Peace Corps were an integral part of the global war on poverty. So the case of Bolivia actually can explain how intertwined, in this case, the Cold War, global war on poverty, the population control, but also sometimes the local very angry reactions, anti-imperialist reactions, could actually fight against this global modernizing project. And sometimes the local reactions of the Latin Americans could be really, really angry. In other cases, in Puerto Rico, is even more complicated, because other sectors of the populations were very keen on population control. They didn't see it at all as a sort of colonial arrogance. So it's still a very controversial topic and hotly debated. I stop here, Jacqueline, and I would like to leave room for question, answer, comments, whatever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Calandra. That was absolutely fascinating. And for students, I hope you understand that this really is opening up a new window into how we understand the sort of advance of social policy. So for any of you students, you can write questions in the Q&A, and I will ask them for you. I want to start, though, because I think Professor Calandra has really brought up this dilemma of modernization, that is, birth control as modernization. At the same time, the identification of certain groups for sterilization and as very regressive. And I was I have to say, quite shocked that liberal regimes were seeing sterilization of the mentally ill particularly troubling. I wanted to know if you could sort of focus a little bit on, did the Catholic Church really react strongly to this, or was it at this time a more minor player? And as well, from the standpoint of the Kennedy administration, whose Alliance for Progress, essentially a fundamental feature is they lost the economic growth goals because of population increases. That is, the population increases overwhelmed the economic growth goals. But where was the administration? We read, as you know, analysts, we read that the administration didn't want to support birth control, but you're showing us a bit of an ambiguity on the population control issue.
Yes, Professor Mazza, thank you for your questions. In Puerto Rico, the Catholic Church was absolutely powerful, very, very influential, extremely against any form of birth control. any form of birth control, as it was in the rest of Mundo Latino, in the Latin world, in the Catholic world, because we have to wait until the end of the 70s, maybe, in order to have a more moderate, nuanced position by the Catholic Church. The strangest thing of all in Puerto Rico is that even if the Catholic Church, of course, did not allow any kind of birth control method, was very, very silent about sterilization. And this is one of the main reasons, among very, very different reasons, why women chose sterilization. It's once and for all. It's, once in a lifetime. You don't have to tell the priest. Catholic Church doesn't know, and you never know. It's a very, very understated topics. It was more tolerable to be sterilized once in a lifetime than using systematically and regularly, say, condoms, IUD, or other. The only the only time I really saw strong, clear position against publicly speaking was at the end of the 60s. At the end of the 60s, I wrote a very clear article from the Catholic press who were specifically referring to sterilization as form of genocide, which is again something not correct. Not even from an ethnographic point of view, because the most interesting thing is that the few ethnographic researches that were carried out highlight that several women chose sterilization. Among very, very poor options. Sometimes it was the only one, sometimes it was the most feasible, the cheapest, but still they chose. So talking about a genocide or about these poor women, it's absolutely an exaggeration, not correct. Same thing can be said for the pill trials. Several women knew that they were testing something unknown, but instead of having 6, 8, 9 children, they wanted to test. I wrote several letters that were telling the Catholic Church is telling me that I can have 10, 12, 13 children. I don't want to. I prefer to be a guinea pig and test the pill, whatever it takes. I don't want to have 15 children. Alliance for Progress, let's say that after Johnson administration, so after 64, we can no longer talk about the Alliance for Progress in strict chronological terms, but this war on poverty, this war on communism, the evergreen war on communism, and the population control in Latin America was extensively carried out also in Bolivia, also in Chile. The book from Javier Castro, Guerra nel Vientre, let's say, shows us how during the Eduardo Frei, the Christian Democrats, between 64 and 70, sterilizations were very widespread and common, and partially funded by the money that Alliance for Progress had given to Chile. So from this point of view, there was a sort of continuity until the early 70s.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Christian Juarez, and he asks, can you talk a little more about the policies that were imposed on Puerto Rico aside from experiments? And I think also I would add for him, was there any debate about picking out Puerto Rico, or they pretty much went with, this is the place we can do these experiments?
Okay, let's say that Puerto Rico was like the perfect place for these biologists, Pincus, for this financial sponsor, McCormick. And there are several letters to explain why Puerto Rico was chosen. Okay, it was at that time Estado Libre Asociado, ELA, which is an ambiguous kind of part of United States, but not properly a state. That's why the FDA, that did not authorize experiments within the United States, could actually keep its eyes closed in Puerto Rico, because it was not exactly United States, but still was very near to the United States from a practical point of view, scientists coming back and forth. It was a very, very overpopulated place, so there was a strong need there to this kind of experiments, and there were women willing to try, as I was telling you earlier. There were women willing to try. So at that time there was no informed consent, so they didn't know exactly, but they were desperate, so there were women willing to try. While inside the United States, within the United States, a few trials had been carried out on mentally ill hospitals. So there were patients who were not exactly 100%, let's say, sure of what they were going through. In Puerto Rican women were more, let's say, willing to test whatever it took. Again, the most interesting thing to my perception is that these feminists, McCormick and also Margaret Sanger, who was the second main actor in these experiments, were not caring at all about the local side effects and the local reactions. So they were only worried about these general appeal for humanity from the women of the whole world, and they were not caring at all about the specific Puerto Rican women, more than 500, who actually were swallowing this huge quantity of hormones. And that also is explained in the early 50s because of the status of Puerto Rico as Estado Libre Asociado, so part of the United States, but not exactly a state.
Excuse me, I think we want to go back to that issue of the specialness of Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico sees itself more in the Latin American world, and it's Spanish speaking. And I was asking sort of how widespread was the knowledge? Were women kind of keeping this information that they were getting sterilized and they were experimenting with birth control? Were they keeping that quiet from their husbands? That is, was that you really uncovered something that I don't hear that much about? Was it well known at the time?
No, definitely not, because the typical Puerto Rican macho man is against all forms of birth control. So the women kept it secretly, and one of the main reasons also why they chose sterilization is because it was in their hands. They secretly went to hospitals, sometimes it was for free. They decided, they did it just once in a lifetime, and they did not have to negotiate all the time with husbands who were basically against birth control, because as is widely known in the typical machista macho culture, it's not a problem if the woman gets pregnant 12, 13 or 14 times, no? So family planning is not an issue. At that time, it was not an issue. Of course, it was an issue for the women. No, it was not an issue. Let's say it was not a matter of negotiation inside the couples.
I think that's a really interesting point, because when we look today at, for example, the conditional cash transfer program that puts the power of money into the hands of women, we have seen that it has upset the dynamic between men and women, and that we've had increases in domestic violence associated with, in essence, women's empowerment. How would you put this in the balance of women, in essence, being thrust into this experimental stage and the empowerment issue that birth control brings on?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because, you know, Jacqueline, the paradox is that the pill was tested on Puerto Rican women, but we have to wait several years until Puerto Rican women could actually purchase the pill and use it, okay? So the pill was tested on them. It was the late 50s. Then it was commercialized in the USA in 1960, but we have to wait several years until you could actually find it in Latin America. So the first consumers were US women, and still we had several scandals inside the feminist movement in the United States. Nelson hearing pills. There was a senator who was actually who carried some investigations pushed by a very famous journalist, Barbara Seaman. The Doctor Case Against the Pill is the main publication she wrote, because several women in the United States were the first consumers, okay, the first customers of this pill, and they also went through hard, severe side effects. So they also realized that these pills maybe were dangerous in a way, so they discovered, okay. Still, even if in the documents that denounced these side effects by Barbara Seaman and other US women, the very first women who tested the pill, the Puerto Ricans, almost never ever appear. It was not their concern. So it's a paradox within the paradox.
That's incredibly fascinating. And I just wanted students, I have a lot of Latin American students, and I think the issue of birth control is still incredibly controversial in Latin America. It's only opening in a few countries. And how do you see the current issue of women taking birth control in Latin America for our kind of final summary of this issue?
Well, now things have changed a lot, of course. Things have changed a lot. It's very, very difficult to draw conclusion for the whole Latin America. Okay, we all the time would need to focus on specific national case, because, for instance, talking about Cuba, no, it's a totally different world from Puerto Rico, even if it's very nearby. Or talking about, and also there is a matter of ethnic groups and social belonging. Okay, so Latin American women, it's something that we can't generalize as it was one block. Let's say we really have to be very careful in terms of country, in terms of which kind of women, which kind of social or ethnic group. There are countries like Cuba where the birth control has been a part of the global and wider health system. It was something guaranteed, it was something free, even if there was still a strong Catholic Church, but during Castro regime, you know, it's been contained a lot, no, the influence of the Catholic Church. There are other countries like Argentina or Chile, who seems to be nearer to our, let's say, Western standards, no, modern standards, but still, if you see that in Argentina, until 3-4 years ago, there was a debate in the Senate to legalize abortion, you know, there is still a long way to go. And for ethnic groups, again, it's another story, because still in 2000, in the new millennium, some ethnic groups perceives birth control not as a form of empowerment, but a form of imposition by upper class or white women. So they want the right to have all the children they want, okay, many. So it's really, really difficult to generalize. We have to think about specific countries, specific social group, and the most interesting thing of all that, and we actually need more ethnographic research. Because many things have been said to Puerto Rican, but not many researchers like Iris Lopez have been working with the women, interviewing women. What she did is interview 3 generations of women, more than 100 women along 3 generations for 25 years. So she actually listened to their words, their positions, their life stories. This is the most interesting thing. We should push more ethnography and to listen what the actual women want, not what other women think that women would deserve.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Megan Doherty, which is, what do you think of the state of women's rights and birth control today in Puerto Rico and Latin America as compared to the time period you did this research? Has there been progress or more reversal?
No, it's definitely a different story. Why? I mean, since the early 80s, of course, we have a more nuanced position by the Catholic Church. Sterilizations were not, let's say, these very impressive figures of 35% of women were relative to the 1930s to the end of the 1960s. Okay, so today the situation is very, very different. It's still very widespread in the Neo-Ricans in New York. It's still more widespread in New York among the Puerto Rican women than in Puerto Rico itself, because of course the options we have, it's more nuanced. So women can actually choose today much more than they used to be in the past. So sterilization is not the one and only available cheapest option. That's why the sterilization rates have decreased a lot. So it's today it's really different story in Puerto Rico, but still, since the 30s to the end of 70s, so for more than 40 years, it was one of the places in the world which presented the highest rate of sterilization compared to the very small surface of the island itself.
Thank you, Professor Calandra. And I think I want to give you a warm thank you from all of SAIS. You have really opened our eyes to this issue that, as you have sort of noted, is both under-researched and sort of unseen in terms of the relations both with Puerto Rico and Latin America. So I'd like to give applause from SAIS Europe and thank you. And we really hope to host you in a better COVID world sometime this spring. We would love to invite you back. So thank you so much for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, students, for participating your first night of classes. Thank you again.
Bye, Jacqueline. Thank you so much. Bye-bye to the students.